The call that changed everything. Most people believe the last words of a dying man bring comfort. My brother's final 2 words did the exact opposite. They uncovered a betrayal so devastating that it tore our family apart. At first, those 2 words made no sense. I wanted to believe I'd misunderstood them. That grief had twisted what I'd seen and heard in those final moments. I was wrong. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave your city, state, or country in the comments. It truly means a lot to see how far these stories reach. And if you enjoy emotional family mysteries filled with unexpected twists, consider subscribing. There are many more stories waiting for you. My name is Jack. I'm 67 years old, retired after nearly 4 decades repairing heavy equipment across southern Arizona. My hands are rough. My knees complain every morning. And these days my biggest decision is usually whether to fish at sunrise or wait until evening. Life had already taught me how quickly everything can change. 2 years before all of this happened, I lost my wife Helen after 43 years of marriage. Since then, the house had become painfully quiet. I filled my days with small routines just to keep the loneliness from swallowing me, working in the garage, fixing old tools that didn't need fixing, and taking long drives with no real destination. Then my phone rang. The number belonged to a hospice center near Boise. The woman on the other end spoke gently. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes. I'm calling about your brother, Thomas." For a moment, I couldn't answer. Nobody had called him Thomas in everyday life for years. To everyone who loved him, he was simply Tom. "I'm sorry," the nurse continued softly. "Your brother asked us to contact you. His condition has become critical. We believe you should come as soon as possible." Those words settled heavily in the silence around me. Tom, and I hadn't spoken in almost 6 years. Not because we hated each other. Life had simply drifted us onto separate roads. He stayed in Idaho after retiring from construction. I remained in Arizona. Birthdays became phone calls. Holidays became promises we'd meet next year. Eventually, even those promises faded away. As I packed an overnight bag, one memory returned with startling clarity. I was 8 years old. Winter had arrived early that year, and my gloves had torn apart. I remember standing outside our school, trying to hide my freezing hands inside my sleeves. The next morning, Tom handed me a brand new pair of gloves. He shrugged when I asked where he'd gotten them. Years later, after we'd both become fathers, I mentioned those gloves. Tom laughed and finally admitted the truth. He'd given me his own. For an entire week, he'd walk to school with his hands buried inside his coat pockets because he wanted me to stay warm. That was my brother. The kind of man who quietly carried discomfort if it meant someone else wouldn't have to. The drive to Boise felt endless. Every mile brought another memory I hadn't visited in years. Camping trips, broken down trucks we somehow managed to repair together. The day he stood beside me at Helen's funeral without saying much at all, simply placing one hand on my shoulder because he knew words weren't enough. By the time I reached the hospice center, the sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains. The building itself was peaceful, too peaceful. Soft music drifted through the lobby, while nurses spoke in hushed voices. The receptionist looked up as I approached. "You must be Jack." I nodded. Then I wiped my hands against my jeans before answering. "I'm here for my brother." She offered a sympathetic smile before leading me down a quiet hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last. "Outside room 214, she stopped. "He's awake," she whispered, "but he doesn't have much strength left." For a long moment, I simply stared at the closed door. I wasn't ready. Not after 6 years. Not after everything we'd left unsaid. Finally, I took a slow breath and stepped inside. Tom looked impossibly small beneath the white blankets. The strong man who had once lifted engines with his bare hands now struggled just to breathe. When his eyes found mine, they filled with tears. "So," he whispered, "you finally made it." I crossed the room without saying a word and wrapped my arms around him as carefully as I could. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Some apologies are too deep for words. After several moments, he pulled back slightly. His lips trembled, as though he wanted to tell me something important. Again and again, he tried to force the words out. Nothing came. Fear crossed his face. Not fear of dying. Fear that he might run out of time before telling me something that couldn't wait. His eyes darted toward the closed door. Then, with the last strength he seemed to have, he reached desperately toward a notepad beside his bed, his trembling hands searching for a pen. Whatever Tom was trying to tell me, it mattered more to him than saying goodbye. The 2 words. For a second, I didn't understand what Tom was reaching for. His fingers shook so badly that the pen slipped from his hand and rolled across the blanket. I grabbed it before it could fall to the floor and placed it back between his fingers. Easy, I whispered. I'm here. Take your time. He nodded faintly. Every movement looked painful. His breathing had become shallow, and the oxygen machine beside his bed released a steady, rhythmic hiss that filled the silence between us. Slowly, with enormous effort, Tom pressed the pen against the paper. The first letter came out crooked, then another. His hand trembled so violently that I had to steady the notepad with both hands. When he finally stopped writing, he pushed the pad toward me. Only 2 words were written there. Not Kale. My stomach dropped. Of every name I expected to see, my nephew's was the last one. Tom had loved Kale from the day he was born. He carried him on his shoulders through county fairs, coached his little league games, and never missed a birthday, if he could help it. Nothing about those 2 words made sense. I looked back at Tom. What do you mean? I asked quietly. Not Kale, what? His eyes widened. He tried to speak again, but only a faint rasp escaped his lips. His hand tightened around my wrist with surprising strength. For one brief moment, it felt as though he was pouring every remaining ounce of strength into a sentence he could no longer say. Then his grip loosened. The room suddenly felt much colder. A nurse hurried inside after noticing the change in his breathing. Another followed close behind. Someone gently guided me away from the bed as the medical team surrounded my brother. I stood frozen near the doorway, still clutching the notepad. A minute later, the room became painfully quiet. The nurse stepped toward me, her expression gentle. I'm so sorry, she said softly. He passed peacefully. Peacefully. The word didn't match what I just witnessed. Tom hadn't looked peaceful. He had looked desperate. Desperate to make sure I saw those 2 words before it was too late. After signing several forms, I walked into the nearly empty hallway. Everything felt strangely unreal. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, while visitors moved quietly from room to room. I looked down at the notepad again. Not Kale. The words refused to leave my mind. What was Tom trying to tell me? Protect Kale? Distrust Kale? Warn me about something? None of it fit the man I had known. As I stood there, an elderly woman sitting across the hall caught my attention. She had silver hair pulled neatly into a braid and a knitted blanket folded across her lap. She watched me for a long moment before speaking. You're Tom's brother. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She offered a faint smile. Tom talked about you. He kept saying he needed to hold on until his brother got here. A lump formed in my throat. He knew. I asked. She nodded slowly. I think he did. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she glanced toward the room Tom had just left forever. He wasn't afraid of dying, she said quietly. He was afraid he wouldn't have enough time. The word sent a chill through me. I looked at the notepad again. Did he ever mention Kale? I asked. The woman hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty crossed her face. I don't know what happened in your family, she replied carefully. But during the last few days, she paused. He seemed worried whenever someone mentioned his son. Before I could ask another question, a nurse approached carrying a small brown envelope. We found these among your brother's belongings, she explained. They were labeled with your name. Inside were Tom's wallet, his wedding ring, a set of old house keys, and a folded piece of paper. Written neatly across the outside were 5 simple words. Open this tomorrow. Alone. I looked up, but the woman across the hall was already standing. As she slowly walked away, she glanced back only once. Tomorrow, she whispered. It will make more sense than tonight. I watched her disappear around the corner, the envelope suddenly feeling much heavier than it should have. By the following afternoon, I would meet Kale face to face. Before that day was over, I'd realize those 2 words were never meant as a goodbye. They were a warning. The envelope. I barely slept that night. The brown envelope sat on the small hotel desk across from my bed, untouched. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted back to it. Open this tomorrow. Alone. I thought about ignoring Tom's instructions. What difference could a few hours make now? He was gone. Whatever he wanted to tell me couldn't hurt him anymore. More than once, I reached for the envelope. More than once, I pulled my hand back. If my brother had spent his final strength making one last request, I owed him at least that much. Morning arrived slowly. I made coffee I couldn't drink and watched the sun climb over the Boise skyline to the motel window. When the clock finally read 9, I locked the room door, silenced my phone, and sat at the small table. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Tom's. It wasn't shaky like the words he'd written in hospice. This had been written weeks earlier. I unfolded the pages. Jack, if you're reading this, it means I ran out of time. I'm sorry for that. There are things I should have told you years ago, but I kept convincing myself I'd find the right moment. I never did. I stopped reading for a second. That sounded exactly like my brother. He had always carried difficult things alone. I continued. The 2 words I wrote weren't meant to accuse anyone. They were meant to stop you from making a mistake I almost made. Don't decide anything until you've learned the whole truth. Promise me that. I frowned. The sentence only deepened the mystery. Then I read the next line. Go see Kale today. Don't tell him about this letter. Just listen. Watch. Let him speak first. That wasn't what I expected. If Tom had wanted to expose someone, why tell me to stay quiet? I turned the page. There was only one more paragraph. After you've spoken with him, go to the old cabin by Willow Creek. Use the house keys in this envelope. What you'll find there belongs to the whole family now. That was it. No explanation. No accusation. Just instructions. I read the letter 3 more times, hoping I'd miss something. I hadn't. The questions only multiplied. Around noon, I drove to the address the hospice receptionist had given me for Kale. The house sat on a quiet street lined with tall pine trees. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk, while sprinklers hissed across neatly cut lawns. It looked like the kind of neighborhood where nothing terrible ever happened. I parked across the street for a moment. The front yard was tidy. A blue pickup truck sat in the driveway. Before I could gather my thoughts, the front door opened. A man in his mid-30s stepped outside, carrying a cardboard box. I recognized him immediately. Kale. The last time I'd seen him, he had been 29. Now there were faint gray streaks at his temples and deep circles beneath his eyes. Grief had aged him. When he noticed my truck, he froze. Then recognition slowly spread across his face. Uncle Jack. I stepped out. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he crossed the driveway and wrapped me in a hug. I'm glad you came, he said quietly. His voice cracked. I didn't know if you would. There was no sign of fear, no hint of guilt, only exhaustion. Tom's words echoed in my mind. Just listen. Watch. Let him speak first. So I did. Kale looked toward the house before speaking again. I'm still packing some of Dad's things, he said. I keep finding little reminders of him. He gave a tired smile. It's harder than I thought. Everything about him felt genuine. If he was hiding something, he hid it better than anyone I'd ever met. As we carried the box inside, my eyes wandered across the living room. Family photographs covered nearly every wall. One picture caught my attention. It showed Tom standing beside Kale at a fishing lake, both of them laughing as they held up the same enormous trout. The frame was worn from years of being handled. Whoever lived here had treasured that memory. Kale noticed me looking. That was Dad's favorite day, he said. He talked about it all the time. I looked back at him, then at the photograph, then at the letter still folded inside my jacket pocket. Nothing matched. A father who proudly displayed pictures of his son. A dying message that simply read not Kale. And a letter telling me not to judge anyone too soon. For the first time since arriving in Idaho, I wondered if I'd been asking the wrong question. Maybe Tom hadn't been trying to tell me who to fear. Maybe he was trying to tell me what not to believe. Just then, Kale set the box on the dining table and looked at me with tired eyes. Uncle Jack, there was something Dad wanted you to know. My heart skipped. Before I could answer, he reached into his pocket. In that moment, I realized my brother hadn't left me the whole story. He'd left part of it with Kale. The key. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Kale's hand remained inside his jacket pocket. Then he slowly pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. The handwriting on the tag stopped me cold. Willow Creek. It matched Tom's handwriting perfectly. I found this in Dad's toolbox a few days ago, Kale said. There was a note with it. He walked to the kitchen counter, unfolded a worn piece of paper, and handed it to me. The note contained only one sentence. If Jack comes, give him the key. Then let him decide what happens next. I looked up. That's all. Kale nodded. That's all. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried the same confusion I've been living with since the hospice. I asked him what it meant. Kale admitted. He just smiled and said, "One day you'll understand." I stared at the key resting in my palm. Tom had planned this. Not just a letter, not just an envelope. Every step. He had divided the truth between us. One piece for me, one piece for Kale. Neither of us could understand it alone. I got a letter this morning. I said carefully, "I haven't told anyone what's in it." Kale didn't seem surprised. He told me you'd probably keep it to yourself. That caught me off guard. How could he know that? A faint smile crossed Kale's face. Because you're his brother. He always said you never spoke until you were sure you understood something. Despite everything, I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Tom. Kale poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table. For nearly an hour, we talked. Not about the mystery. About Tom. His stubbornness. His terrible jokes. The fishing trips they took every spring. The old pickup truck he'd refused to replace because, according to him, it still gets me there. The more Kale spoke, the harder it became to connect him with those 2 haunting words. Nothing about him suggested deception. If anything, he looked like a son trying to survive the worst week of his life. Finally, I asked a question that had been weighing on me. Kale, when was the last time you and your dad argued? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared into his coffee. About 3 months ago. What happened? He wanted to sell the cabin. I frowned. The one at Willow Creek? Kale nodded. I told him not to. Why? Because Mom loved that place. It was the last place where we were all together before she passed away. I couldn't stand the thought of strangers owning it. That made perfect sense. So he kept it? Yes. Kale hesitated. But after that, he started driving out there alone. Almost every week. Sometimes he'd stay for hours. My grip tightened around the brass key. Tom had been hiding something at the cabin. Not once. Repeatedly. Did he ever tell you why? No. He always changed the subject. Silence settled over the room. Finally, Kale stood. I think you should see it. The cabin? He nodded. Dad wanted you there. I'll come with you if you want. I remembered the letter. Go see Kale today. It never said to bring him. It simply said to listen. For several seconds, I wrestled with a decision. Then I slowly shook my head. I think I need to go alone. To my surprise, Kale didn't seem offended. Instead, he reached into a kitchen drawer and removed a folded county map. He circled a narrow gravel road with a pen. The bridge looks unstable, he said, so park before you cross it. The cabin is about a 5-minute walk from there. As he handed me the map, something slipped from between its folds. A photograph drifted onto the table. I picked it up. It was old. The edges had yellowed with age. 3 people stood in front of the Willow Creek cabin. Tom, his late wife, and a little girl. I looked up slowly. Kale. Who is she? Kale stared at the photograph. The color drained from his face. For several long seconds, he didn't answer. The hidden compartment. The photograph rested on the kitchen table between us. Neither Kale nor I spoke for several long moments. Finally, I slipped it back into the envelope. We'll find the answers, I said. It sounded more confident than I felt. Kale nodded once, but his eyes never left the picture. Whatever Tom had been trying to protect had started long before that final warning. The only question was where he'd hidden the rest of the truth. We searched the cabin again, this time with purpose instead of desperation. Rather than tearing through every drawer, we focused on the places that mattered most to Tom. His old writing desk, the stone fireplace he'd built himself, the shelves lined with fishing guides and faded family photo albums, the small bedroom overlooking the lake. Dust coated almost every surface. Nothing looked as though it had been touched in years. Standing there, I could almost imagine Tom stepping to the front door with a tackle box in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, complaining that I'd arrived too early for the fish to start biting. The memory faded as quickly as it came. Kale ran his hand along one side of the bookshelf. Uncle Jack. I turned. Look at this. One shelf didn't sit flush against the wall. It was recessed just enough to catch the light differently. We exchanged a glance. Carefully, we pulled the entire shelf forward. A narrow compartment had been built into the wall behind it. Neither of us moved at first. Tom hadn't stumbled across this place. He'd created it. Inside rested 3 objects. A worn leather journal, a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Tom's unmistakable handwriting, and a small velvet pouch. The air inside the cabin suddenly felt heavier. For several moments, neither of us reached inside. I stretched my hand toward the envelope, then stopped. If Tom had written directly to me, the letter might explain everything. But the journal looked different, older. Its leather was cracked from years of being opened and closed. It didn't feel like something written in a single evening. It felt like years of secrets collected one page at a time. Part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know what was inside. The other part knew I'd never forgive myself if I walked away. I picked up the journal. The cover felt smooth with age. As I opened it, something folded inside slipped free and drifted onto the wooden floor. Kale bent down before I could. It wasn't a letter. It was an old newspaper clipping. He handed it to me. The headline made my heart pound. Missing child case reopened after 12 years. Below the headline was a faded photograph of a little girl. Neither of us recognized her. At least, I didn't think we did. I looked at Kale. He stared at the clipping with the same confusion I felt. "What does this have to do with Dad?" he whispered. I had no answer. Before either of us could read another word, a car door slammed outside. The sharp sound shattered the silence surrounding the cabin. Kale's head snapped toward the window. Neither of us had told anyone we were coming. A second door closed. Then came the unmistakable crunch of slow footsteps on the gravel leading toward the porch. Someone had just parked outside the cabin, and whoever it wasn't supposed to know we were there. An unexpected visitor. The footsteps stopped just outside the front door. Neither of us moved. The journal remained open on the table, the newspaper clipping lay beside it, like evidence waiting to be discovered. Another sound followed. 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not impatient, just deliberate. Kale looked at me. "What do we do?" I quietly closed the journal and slipped the clipping back inside. "Don't say anything yet." The cabin fell silent again. Then a woman's voice came through the old wooden door. "I know someone's inside." She didn't sound angry. She sounded tired. "I only want to talk." Kale frowned. "Do you know her?" I shook my head. "No." After a long pause, I stepped toward the door. Years of working around people had taught me something simple. Most danger announces itself with shouting. This voice didn't. Still, I kept one hand on the doorknob without unlocking it. "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Grace." A brief silence followed. I was a friend of Tom's. My grip tightened. Very few people knew Tom still came to this cabin. Even fewer would know Kale and I were here. "How did you find us?" I asked. "I didn't." Her answer came quickly. "I came looking for Tom." The words hung in the air. When I didn't respond, she spoke again. "I didn't know he had passed away until yesterday." I slowly opened the door. Standing on the porch was a woman in her early 60s. Her gray jacket was dusty from the road. She held an old canvas bag against her side. Her eyes settled on me. You must be Jack. I stiffened. Tom showed me photographs years ago. She offered a sad smile. He talked about you more than you probably realize. I wasn't sure whether to believe her. What did you want with my brother? Grace glanced past me into the cabin. Then her eyes landed on Kale. For just a second, something changed in her expression. Not fear, recognition. So, she whispered, "You're Kale." Kale took a cautious step forward. "Have we met?" She slowly shook her head. "No, but I've known your name for a very long time." The cabin seemed smaller somehow. Grace looked back at me. "I've carried something for nearly 15 years. She carefully opened the canvas bag. My heart pounded. Instead of taking out a weapon, she removed a sealed manila envelope. Tom's handwriting covered the front. In large block letters it read, "Only if Jack finds a journal." I stared at the envelope, then at the journal resting on the table behind me. Tom had expected this moment. Expected someone named Grace to arrive. Expected me to find the journal first. Nothing about this was an accident. Grace held the envelope toward me, but didn't let go. "Before you open it," she said quietly, "there's something you need to understand." She looked at Kale, then back at me. "The missing girl in that newspaper clipping." She stopped. Her face had gone pale. She drew a slow breath, as if choosing her next words carefully. "I think it's time you knew why Tom spent the last 12 years living with a secret. And for the first time since my brother died, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the truth. The letter Tom never wanted anyone else to read." For several long seconds, no one spoke. Grace still held the envelope between us. I finally reached out and took it. The paper felt old. The edges had softened with age, as though it had been carried from place to place for years. Across the front, Tom had written only 7 words. "Only if Jack finds a journal." He hadn't left this to chance. He'd planned for this moment. I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter. I recognized Tom's handwriting immediately. Steady, deliberate, the same careful script I'd seen on birthday cards, grocery lists, and every Christmas note he'd ever sent. I unfolded the pages and began to read. "Jack, if you're reading this, then I wasn't able to tell you everything myself. Finding the journal means you've already taken the first step. I wish none of this had ever become your responsibility. I spent years hoping I'd find another way. I never wanted you to carry this burden. But after everything that's happened, you're the only person I still trust to finish what I couldn't." I paused. The words blurred for a moment. Tom had always been the one protecting everyone else. Even now, he was trying to protect me. I continued reading. "Please don't judge Kale for what you're about to discover. He has lived with questions his entire life, without ever knowing the truth. There are people who believe our family destroyed their lives. If they learn the truth before you do, they'll come after the wrong person. That's why I gave you only 2 words before I died." The cabin felt impossibly quiet. I turned to the final page. "The journal explains everything, but don't read it all at once. Some truths only make sense after you've seen where they began. Start with the entry dated September 18th, 2013. I slowly lowered the letter. Kale looked toward the journal. "So, that's where we begin?" Grace gave a small nod. "Tom never told me the whole story," she said quietly. "He only asked me to make sure that if this day ever came, you started with that page." I opened the journal again. Most of the entries described ordinary days. Fishing trips, repairs around the cabin, quiet evenings by the lake. Then I found the date. September 18th, 2013. The handwriting was different, uneven, hurried, almost trembling. The very first sentence stole the air from my lungs. "Today, someone left a little girl on my doorstep." I stared at the page. Slowly, I looked up at Grace. She said nothing. Her face told me she'd been waiting years for this moment. Before I could read another line, a faint crunch echoed somewhere beyond the trees. Kale looked toward the window. "Did you hear that?" Another sound followed, gravel shifting beneath tires. Then, through the front window, faint headlights flickered between the pines. Grace's expression changed instantly. She stepped quietly to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. A second later, she froze. Car doors began closing. One, then another, then another. She let the curtain fall. Her voice was barely above a whisper. We're not alone anymore. Outside, slow footsteps started up the gravel path toward the cabin. And somehow, someone had discovered we were here. The truth Tom carried for 12 years. The cabin was so quiet I could hear the pages of Tom's journal shifting beneath my hands. No one spoke. Grace stood near the window, giving us space. Kale remained across the table, his eyes fixed on the journal. He looked exhausted, not just from the past 2 days. From years of carrying questions no one had ever answered. I looked down at the page Tom had told me to read. His handwriting had grown uneven, as though every sentence had cost him something. September 18th, 2013. I made a decision today that changed this family forever. If you're reading this, Jack, you've probably spent years believing the same lie everyone else believed. I can't blame you. I helped create it. My pulse quickened. I turned the page. 12 years ago, money disappeared from our family's business account. By the end of that week, everyone believed one person had taken it. I glanced at Kale. He lowered his eyes. I always wondered why some of our relatives stopped talking to me. He said quietly, they never said it outright, but I could feel it. Grace looked down at the floor. She remained silent. I continued reading. They believed Kale was responsible. He was young. He had access to the office. And the evidence seemed impossible to argue with. A knot formed in my stomach. I remembered those months. The whispered conversations. The uncomfortable family gatherings. The way people suddenly stopped trusting Kale. Back then, I believed the same thing. Not because I wanted to, because the facts seemed undeniable. Tom's next words hit even harder. Kale never stole a single dollar. I stopped breathing for a moment. Across the table, Kale stared at me. His face had gone pale. What? His voice barely rose above a whisper. I looked back at the journal. I knew he was innocent within days. I found proof. But exposing the truth would have destroyed someone else I loved. The room fell completely still. My mind raced. If Kale hadn't betrayed the family, then who had? I turned another page. Tom had underlined the next sentence twice. I let everyone believe the lie. Every holiday, every birthday, every year, I watched my own son carry a burden that belonged to someone else. Kale covered his face with both hands. I knew Dad believed me, he whispered. I just never understood why he stayed silent. Neither did I. Not yet. I reached the final paragraph on the page. The person who betrayed this family wasn't Kale. Before you judge them, read the next entry. Only then will you understand why I made the hardest decision of my life. I slowly closed the journal. The silence inside the cabin felt heavier than ever. Grace finally spoke. Tom hated what that secret did to both of you. I looked at her. You knew? She nodded gently. I knew there was a secret. Her voice trembled. But Tom never told me what it was. She glanced at the journal. He only said that one day, when the time was right, you finally understand why his last words had to be. She looked at Kale with quiet compassion. Not Kale. For the first time since my brother died, his final words finally made sense. But they raised an even more painful question. If Kale hadn't betrayed our family, then who had? The truth my brother took to his grave, revised. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The cabin had gone completely quiet. The only sound was a faint crackle of the fireplace and the pages of Tom's journal resting in my hands. I forced myself to keep reading. Jack, if you've reached this page, then you've already seen my final words. Not Kale. Those 2 words weren't meant to accuse anyone. They were my last chance to stop you from believing a lie that nearly destroyed our family. My chest tightened. I turned the page. Tom's handwriting grew slower, more uneven. 12 years ago, the money disappeared. Everyone believed Kale had taken it because he'd argued with me the day before. He blamed himself for years, even though he never knew exactly why people looked at him differently afterward. But he wasn't the one who betrayed us. I swallowed hard. Every assumption I'd carried for more than a decade suddenly felt fragile. The next paragraph made me stop breathing. It was Helen. For several seconds, I couldn't read another word. My hand began to shake. Across the table, Kale stared at me. "What is it?" he whispered. I looked at him, unable to answer. Then I lowered my eyes and continued reading. "I know this will break your heart. It broke mine, too. Helen came to me one week before the money disappeared. She wasn't greedy. She was terrified. Tom explained that Helen had secretly borrowed a large amount of money after Jack's small business had begun failing. She hoped she could repay it before anyone found out. Instead, the debt kept growing. The people she owed became threatening. She believed that if she couldn't pay them soon, they would come after Jack as well. She felt trapped, alone, ashamed. She begged me not to tell you," Tom wrote. "She said she couldn't bear watching you lose the little hope you still had." I closed my eyes. All those years, I believed our marriage had been built entirely on honesty. Now I realized Helen had been carrying a secret burden I never even noticed. Not because she didn't love me, but because she was afraid. Tom's letter continued. She promised she'd tell you once everything was over. But before she could, she died. The words blurred through my tears. After a funeral, I want to tell you the truth more times than I can count. Every time I tried, I looked at you grieving the woman you loved. I couldn't bring myself to destroy the memory that was helping you survive, so I stayed silent. That silence became the greatest mistake of my life. I finally understood. Tom hadn't kept a secret because he wanted to protect Helen. He'd kept it because he couldn't bear adding another unbearable loss to mine. The final page was shorter. "Jack, don't spend the rest of your life angry at someone who can no longer answer for her mistakes. She made a terrible decision, but she loved you until her last breath. If anyone deserves a second chance, it's Kale. He's lived under a shadow that never belonged to him. Please give him back his father's name." I lowered the journal. The room was silent. Kale looked at me with uncertainty, as if he were afraid of what I might say. For years, I quietly believed there was something my nephew wasn't telling us. Now I knew he'd been carrying suspicion he never deserved. I stood and walked around the table. Without saying a word, I pulled him into a hug. "I'm sorry," I whispered. So sorry." For a moment he didn't move. Then I felt him wrap his arms around me. "I always wondered why Uncle," he said quietly. "I thought maybe Dad blamed me for something." "He never did," I replied. "He spent 12 years trying to protect you." Kale nodded, tears filling his eyes. "I wish he'd told me." "So do I." Grace watched quietly from the doorway. Tom had never trusted her with every secret. He'd only asked her to make sure I reached the truth when he no longer could. Without her, I might never have found the journal or understood what those final 2 words really meant. As dawn's first light crept through the cabin windows, I looked once more at my brother's final letter. His last words hadn't exposed Kale. They had saved him. The betrayal that tore our family apart had never come from a son. It had come from fear, silence, and a secret carried too long. And by telling the truth at last, Tom gave us something I thought our family had lost forever, a chance to forgive, and finally, to heal. The words that finally set us free. A week after Tom's funeral, our family gathered one last time. Not at the cemetery, not at the cabin, but around the same dining room table where we'd celebrated birthdays, holidays, and countless ordinary evenings before everything changed. For years, that table had carried an invisible weight, unanswered questions, quiet suspicions, conversations no one was brave enough to have. This time, I stood at the head of the table with Tom's journal in my hands. "I owe all of you the truth," I said. The room fell silent. Kale sat across from me, looking as nervous as I felt. For so many years, he'd lived with whispers he could never understand. Some relatives had kept their distance. Others had looked at him with doubt, even if they never spoke it aloud. None of it had been fair. I opened the journal and carefully read the pages Tom had written for me. No one interrupted. When I reached the words, "Not Kale," I looked around the room. My brother's final message was an accusation, I said quietly. It was his last attempt to protect his son. Several people lowered their eyes. A few wiped away tears. The silence that followed felt different from the silence we'd carried for 12 years. This one wasn't filled with suspicion. It was filled with understanding. I walked over to Kale and placed a journal in his hands. Your father never stopped believing in you. I told him. He loved you every single day of his life. Kale looked down at the worn pages, his eyes filling with tears. I spent years wondering why everyone looked at me differently, he said. I thought maybe I'd done something I couldn't even remember. You didn't, I replied. You never did. For the first time since I'd known him, the burden he'd been carrying seemed to lift from his shoulders. Later that afternoon, after everyone had gone home, Kale and I drove to the cemetery. We stood beside Tom's grave without speaking. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the quiet sounds of late afternoon. Finally, Kale smiled through his tears. I think Dad knew you'd figure it out. I smiled back. No, I said softly. I think he hoped we'd figure it out, together. Before we left, I rested my hand on the cool stone. Your last 2 words save your son. I whispered, and they saved the rest of us too. As we walked away, I realized something Tom had understood long before I did. The deepest betrayals aren't always born from hatred. Sometimes they're born from fear. But the strongest families aren't the ones who never face painful truths. They're the ones willing to face them together. And sometimes 2 simple words are enough to change everything.